Let's move on to our second main topic today. And our second main topic today gets submitted to us by Shaun M, who writes, "Hey John, as expected, The Rise of Skywalker opened huge to $176 million, which exceeded the $160 million Disney forecasted. However, it's less than The Last Jedi's $220 million. How should it be looked at?" All right. Thanks a lot for the question, man, and saying that. And yeah, so Star Wars The Rise of Skywalker has now come out. It's open in theaters. We did our big spoiler review yesterday. You guys know I didn't like the film. I think there's a lot going for it. I think it's got some definite positives. I understand why a lot of people like it, and that's awesome. I celebrate that. But unfortunately, it just didn't work for me. That aside, the movie comes out and makes $176 million, making it one of the largest opening weekends in cinematic history. Currently, it sits at number 12 of the all-time list of biggest opening weekends ever. What also needs to be pointed out, though, is that this is the lowest opening of the new Star Wars trilogy. To be fair, that just follows the pattern of what the other Star Wars trilogies have done. Every other Star Wars trilogy so far has had the first film open the biggest, the second film open less, and the third film open less. So we can go into and debate what that's all about. So the question here becomes, is a $176 million opening one of the biggest of all time, but the smallest for this for this particular trilogy? Should that be looked as a positive or a negative? Now, Rob and I have different opinions on this, and I'm going to give you mine and give him the second word, the last word on this. To me, as somebody who did not like this movie, there's no way you can look at this as negative. You just cannot look at this as a negative. I mean, this is a film. When you open any film, I don't care what title put on. If you are being fair and you are trying to be as objective as possible, now we're talking subjective art, we can just debate the quality of the movie, but is a $176 million thing a good opening? I think if you're trying to be fair and balanced and take prejudice out of it and just look at a movie came out that had this X budget and it made this amount of money at the box office, you got to ask yourself the question, should that be considered a success? $176 million opening weekend, granted for a movie that I didn't like, but still, that opens to a $176 million opening, one of the biggest opening weekends of all time. There is no way to be fair and objective and taking pre-existing biases out of it that you could possibly look at this. Although we're going to go to a poll here in a second, and clearly some of you do look at it the other way. But I'm just saying, from my point of view, there's no way to look at that as a failure. A step down from the previous one? Absolutely it was. Yes. Is it the greatest opening of all time? No. But it is a positive, great, solid opening that most filmmakers and most studios would kill to have a film open to $176 million. Absolutely they would. Absolutely. And so I want to propose why, if you honestly put baggage aside and pre-existing biases aside and just look at it for what it is, you have to come to the conclusion, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have to come to the conclusion that this is a positive outcome, a great outcome, a money-making outcome. This is a huge win for them. I think this is a huge win for them. Despite how I feel about the film personally, this is a huge win. But Rob, I know that you have a different opinion on this and a different perspective on this. You think this should be looked at more negatively, and I give you the floor. Why do you think that this should be looked at more negatively?
First of all, as you pointed out, this followed a pattern of Star Wars movies. You know, the I guess the law of diminishing returns in terms of opening. Now, I think that this, as far as Star Wars is concerned, and you know, you only have to go back and look at what Disney has been doing with the MCU, what Marvel has been doing with the MCU. How the careful planning, the way that they've created their storytelling, the way that the world was anticipating Endgame, you know, Star Wars fandom has completely changed. It's really, there's a lot of divisiveness, as we always talked about. But this film was not just a lesser opening. It was a substantially reduced opening from both Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. And I can't help but think that this is seen as a disappointment. And as you pointed out, it is correct. Any filmmaker worth their salt would love to have an opening at $175 million or whatever the actuals turn out to be tomorrow or whatever. Absolutely. But this is a Star Wars movie that has apparently opened almost 50 million less than Last Jedi opened. And that for this finale, which, by the way, they threw everything but the kitchen sink at. I mean, they certainly didn't spare any expense making this movie. And I'll bet you, with the reshoots, I bet this movie cost a lot more money than Force Awakens or The Last Jedi. I don't know.
They're saying it actually cost a little bit less than The Last Jedi.
See, I can't believe that.
Oh, I do. Oh, absolutely, I do.
But maybe it did. But I still think it has to be seen as a disappointment because it's a substantial fall from the previous film, and that to me is, I think it's indicative of where they're going. I mean, it shouldn't have been like this. This movie should have ended on a gigantic. People should have been anticipating this movie the way they anticipated Endgame, which is another film, that came out this year from the same studio. And I think, look, there's a lot of people that are going to talk about the mismanagement of Star Wars, and I don't think that's the case. I think this really just comes down to what have we learned? We have learned from this Star Wars trilogy that it's always better, and I've said on my own show that there's no way they could have made 3 movies or planned for 3 movies all at once, because honestly, John, even though it seems crazy, they didn't know how Star Wars was going to do. They didn't. It was not a foregone conclusion that Star Wars was going to be masterful when Disney bought it. They just didn't know. So they didn't plan out a trilogy because they had to make sure they weren't going to throw good money good money after bad. So they had to see if it worked. But once they knew that Force Awakens worked, they really needed to sit down and say, okay, we need to craft an overarching story. We know we're going to make these 2 movies. Let's work in tandem. Let's make it happen. I know directors came and went and things like that, but I think this box office is really indicative of how they went about making these films.
Okay, I'll tell you why I disagree. Because I think you have to purposefully cherry pick out one unique perspective to make it look like this is negative. If you look by
I don't think it's negative.
I think if you look at any metric, by any unit of measurement that you look at this situation, $176 million opening, one of the biggest opening weekends in the history of the cinematic art form. By the way, if you take out the other films in the trilogy, even accounting for inflation, this would be the largest opening weekend of any Star Wars movie in history. There's 1,000 different ways you can look at this that say, clearly this is positive. I think you have to go out of your way to find a way to look at this in such a way that it's a negative. And I agree with the diminishing things. When you don't want to see any film franchise that's going this in its trajectory, right? You don't. But if the bottom point of that trajectory here is still a massive, huge box office hit, then you're still doing good. Like, a hit is a hit is a hit.
That's true.
So, I mean, I don't know. I think, yes, if you want to find one unique way to look at it to make it seem negative, you can. But I think if you're going to stand back and say, well, let's take all the perspectives into account, I think overwhelmingly it comes out in the favor of you got to look, again, and this is a movie I don't like, but I don't think there's any way you can look at this other than a huge win and a positive.
Let me ask you, what if this movie doesn't hit $1 billion?
Does it not hit $1 billion? I need some more specific. Does not hit $1 billion as it makes $980 million?
Well, I mean, let's just
that
say
is still a big hit.
It is still a big hit, but I think you can't. You also have to take into consideration. You have to look at this holistically as far as this Star Wars franchise goes. Like, look, when Star Trek V came out in 1989, it didn't do well. And it was considered monetarily compared to the other movies. And it was considered to be a disappointment within the Star Trek franchise. To this day, it's still probably the least successful, with maybe the exception of Nemesis. But in terms of the expectations and what they spent on it. And it is seen as a movie that is not as well liked as probably the other Star Trek movies. And it's looked at in terms of the franchise as a disappointment. Now, I think that this movie, financially, if it doesn't hit $1 billion, and even Last Jedi made, 1.2 or something like that, if this makes, you can still say yes. Even if it made $800 million, and that's all it made, it would still be considered a hit movie. But I think it would be always looked upon as a disappointment within the Star Wars franchise, the same way that Solo is.
See, I think, well, yeah, but Solo's a movie that made like 400 million, not
Right.
And I think if this thing comes out, say like Batman versus Superman, or Justice League, let's say makes in like the mid 600s, yeah. I mean, the opening weekend, I still think you look at as a huge win. But if it ultimately ends up at $650 million, like say a Justice League did, then you got to look at that as a disappointment. Breaking even is not what a Star Wars movie is supposed to do. It's supposed to make them hundreds of $millions of profit.
Right.
If it gets into 850, 900 millions, I still think it's going to cross the $1 billion mark. Don't know that, but that's my guess. Then, and I've been predicting all along. I don't think it was. I've always said I didn't think this movie was going to make as much as The Last Jedi. I mean, it could. I didn't say it was impossible, but I thought it was going to somewhere in between. But listen, guys, the important thing is here, I wanted to know what you guys thought. Understanding that, on the one hand, one of the biggest opening weekends ever. On the other hand, significantly the lowest opening of the new trilogy. Should this be looked at positively or negatively? And I put that question to you guys, and we made that the topic of today's question of the day. And I put this up on Twitter just before we started the show. Question of the day, simply: The Rise of Skywalker has one of the biggest opening weekends in cinematic history, currently sitting at number 12 with the $176 million opening. But it is also the lowest opening of the new trilogy. Should $176 million be viewed as a positive or negative thing? Right now, a little over 3,700 of you guys have cast your votes so far. 58.1% of you are saying this needs to be looked at positively. 41.9% of you are saying it needs to be looked at negatively. I'll be honest with you. I thought more people would say positive. I really did. So positive's in the lead, but I thought the positive thing would be much higher. So 58.1% are saying it's positive. 41.9% are saying it's a negative. How do you guys look at this opening for The Rise of Skywalker? Now, I'm going to ask you guys, when you jump into the comment section to offer your opinion, take your personal bias of what you thought about the movie out of the equation. I had to do that because I don't like the movie. So I had to take my personal bias of the fact that I didn't like the movie out of the equation. Do you think it's a success? And maybe you love the movie. Take that out of it too. Don't say it's a positive result just because you like the movie. What do you guys think about this? So how should it be looked at? Generally positively, generally negatively? What do you guys think? Jump down to the comment section below and let us know your thoughts. All right.